What if one of the internet's biggest hidden history stories started with something completely real and then went wildly off the rails? Because Tartaria was real, at least as a word on old maps, you can find it in historical atlases. You can find Great Tartary in 18th century cartography. And that's exactly why this topic keeps pulling people in. It feels like the kind of mystery nobody can answer. But here's the part most people miss. The real story is not about a secret empire with erased technology. The real story is about how older mapmakers labeled huge parts of Asia they didn't fully understand, how later borders became more precise, and how that ordinary historical process got reimagined online as evidence of a cover-up. Historical sources and map collections show that Tartary was a broad European label for large parts of Central and North Asia, not proof of a single vanished superstate. And once you see that, the whole mystery changes. Because this isn't really a story about a lost civilization. It's a story about why people keep wanting one. The title of this video says Tartaria's Final Hours and the Dark Day they erased from history. So let's be very clear from the start. There is no verified historical event known as the final day of a global Tartarian empire. There is no accepted evidence that historians covered up a world-spanning civilization called Tartaria. What does exist is a real historical name, Tartary or Tartaria, used by European writers and cartographers for a vast region across Inner Asia, Siberia, and nearby areas, especially when European geographic knowledge of those regions was incomplete. So why do so many people talk about Tartaria like it was a hidden empire destroyed in some dramatic catastrophe? At first, that sounds simple. It isn't, because the Tartaria story survives on a powerful mix of things that are individually true but collectively misleading. Old maps are real. Grand buildings from the 19th century are real. World's fairs really did build massive temporary structures. Cities really did renovate, demolish, and rebuild huge sections of themselves. Photographs really do show older buildings partly below current street level in some places. But that only explains part of it. The jump from those facts to there was a lost advanced civilization erased from history is where the evidence falls apart. Modern articles and historical explainers note that the internet version of Tartaria blends map misunderstandings, architecture myths, and the so-called mud flood idea into a pseudo-historical narrative rather than a documented historical one. So in this video, I want to do something a little different. Not just debunk the claim, not just mock it. I want to walk through why the story is so sticky, where the confusion actually comes from, and what the real history says when you strip away the myth. Because honestly, the truth here is more useful than the fantasy. And this is where things get more interesting. If Tartaria wasn't really a hidden super-civilization, then what exactly were people looking at when they saw that word on all those maps? What Tartary actually meant. On older European maps, Tartary was often a catch-all label, not a country in the modern sense, not a clearly bounded nation-state, more like a broad umbrella term used by outsiders for vast territories across Central Asia, Siberia, Mongolia, and surrounding regions. The exact boundaries changed from map to map, which is one of the biggest clues that it was never a precise, unified political entity in the way the internet myth suggests. The Library of Congress notes that Tartary appears in different places and forms across maps, and even by the 18th century, many maps divided it into multiple regions such as Western Tartary and Chinese Tartary. That matters a lot, because when a place name on old maps shifts around, expands, shrinks, and gets subdivided depending on the cartographer, that usually tells you you're not looking at a hidden empire. You're looking at older geographic language. And older geographic language can be messy. European mapmakers often relied on travelers' reports, partial surveys, second-hand accounts, and inherited traditions from earlier maps. In other words, they were doing the best they could with limited information. A Library of Congress catalog entry for an 18th century Great Tartary map explicitly frames it as a product built from travelers' accounts and observations, which tells you exactly what kind of knowledge system this was. Now here's the real issue. When modern viewers see Great Tartary on a map, they often read it through a modern lens. They think, if it has a name that big, it must have been a single empire. But historical naming doesn't work that cleanly. Old maps also used large labels for broad zones that were culturally, politically, and geographically mixed. The fact that a region had a large printed name on a map does not, by itself, tell you there was one government, one dynasty, one capital, one bureaucracy, one continuous civilization hiding behind it. That's the first major misunderstanding. And once you understand that, the myth loses one of its strongest visual hooks. But not all of it, because the Tartaria story didn't spread just because of maps. It spread because of architecture. The building problem, why architecture became evidence. If you've spent any time around Tartaria content online, you've probably seen the same pattern. Huge old courthouses, cathedrals, train stations, capitol buildings, exposition halls, domes, columns, arches, ornament. And then someone asks, how did people build all this without modern machinery? That question is emotionally effective because it hits a real modern feeling. We look at older monumental architecture and assume the past must have had capabilities we've forgotten. But there's a difference between underestimating historical builders and inventing a civilization to explain them. 19th and early 20th century societies absolutely could build enormous, technically impressive structures. They had industrial labor, rail transport, steel production, masonry traditions, huge workforces, imperial wealth, and in many cases decades of experience building in stone, brick, iron, and later steel. They also documented these projects extensively. The modern Tartaria claim that famous historic buildings were actually inherited from a hidden empire is not supported by that documentary record. But here's the part most people miss. The myth works because the internet is terrible at scale. A 5-second clip of a giant 19th century building feels impossible. It doesn't show you the financing, the labor, the scaffolding, the engineering drawings, the quarrying, the transport networks, the years of construction, and the fact that industrial-era states were extremely good at building things that projected power. And then there's World's Fairs. This is where a lot of viewers get pulled in. You see images of massive exposition buildings from events like the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the argument goes, there's no way these were temporary, therefore they must have been inherited from an earlier advanced civilization. It sounds convincing for about 10 seconds. Then you look closer. Many World's Fair structures were indeed designed to be temporary, often using staff, plaster, timber, iron frames, and other materials that looked grand on camera and in photographs, but were not meant to last forever. That doesn't mean every fair building was flimsy. Some were permanent, some survived, but the broad claim that they were mysterious leftovers from a suppressed empire is not supported by evidence. At first, that sounds simple. It isn't. Because the deeper emotional engine here is not architecture, it's disbelief. People aren't just saying, I don't understand this building. They're saying, I no longer trust the official explanation for anything. And that leads straight into the darkest part of the Tartaria story. Not a real dark day in history, a dark pattern in how misinformation spreads. The dark day that actually happened. The birth of the cover-up story. If there is a dark day in the Tartaria story, it's not the fall of an empire. It's the moment ordinary historical confusion becomes a totalizing conspiracy. This is the pivot point where a loose historical term becomes a hidden civilization, where architectural confusion becomes proof, and where missing context becomes they erased it. That phrase, they erased it, is doing almost all the work. Because once you accept that idea, every gap becomes evidence. No records? Covered up. Conflicting maps? Covered up. Different explanations from different believers? That's just because the truth was suppressed. That structure makes the theory hard to kill because it absorbs contradiction instead of answering it. And this is where things get more interesting, because researchers who study pseudo-history point out that these narratives often do more than entertain. They flatten real cultures, distort real regional histories, and sometimes borrow from nationalist or extremist story frameworks. Recent writing on pseudo-historical conspiracy theories has explicitly used Tartaria as an example of how hidden history narratives can blur fact and fiction and open the door to more dangerous beliefs. That's important. Because on the surface, Tartaria content can look harmless, just old photos, maps, weird questions, and dramatic editing. But under that surface is a bigger habit of mind. If history is always fake, then evidence stops mattering. And once evidence stops mattering, anything can be made true by mood alone. That's why this topic is worth taking seriously. Not because the claim is credible, but because the method is contagious. Now here's the real issue. A lot of people are drawn to Tartaria content for understandable reasons. Some are just fascinated by old maps. Some are interested in forgotten architecture. Some have a legitimate frustration with oversimplified school history. Some notice that official narratives can change and think, correctly, that history is constantly being revised as new evidence appears. That instinct is not the problem. The problem is what comes next. Good history says, let's test that claim. Bad history says, the lack of proof proves the conspiracy. Those are not the same thing. And once you notice that difference, you start seeing the entire Tartaria story in a new way. But that only explains part of it, because there's still one question left. If the evidence is weak, why does the story feel so strong? Why people want Tartaria to be true? This, to me, is the most revealing part of the whole thing. Tartaria is not just a claim about the past, it's a reaction to the present. It tells viewers that history is bigger than they were told, that the world used to be grander, more beautiful, more advanced, maybe more meaningful. That modern life is a decline from something hidden and magnificent, and that is an incredibly seductive idea. Especially in a world where a lot of people feel disconnected from institutions, distrustful of experts, and unimpressed by what modern society builds compared to what older cities seem to have inherited. So when someone sees an ornate train station that no longer exists, or a fairground palace that was demolished, or a buried basement level in an old city, the emotional logic writes itself. We had something extraordinary. We lost it. Someone lied. That is a powerful story. The problem is that powerful stories are not automatically true. Older cities do have partial basement levels, raised street grades, renovations, demolition layers, and reused foundations. That's real urban history, not evidence of a recent civilization-ending mud catastrophe. Likewise, the disappearance of Tartary from maps is consistent with the normal historical shift toward more precise ethnographic and political labels as geographic knowledge expanded. This is the midpoint where a lot of viewers expect the "but what if some of it is true" twist. So let's do that honestly. Could there still be poorly understood episodes in Central Asian history, gaps in cartographic knowledge, or forgotten local histories hidden under oversimplified labels? Absolutely. History is full of complexity, and Tartary as a label really did flatten many different peoples and regions into one vague term from a European perspective. But that is not the same as proving a vanished global empire. That distinction matters. Because real history is often stranger than myth, but it is almost never cleaner. There was no single dramatic final hour when Tartaria vanished from the earth. What happened instead was slower, less cinematic, and much more historically normal. Map language changed, imperial frontiers shifted, scholarship improved, regional names became more specific, and an old catch-all term gradually fell out of use. That sounds less exciting than a buried advanced civilization, but it has one advantage: it's actually supported. And once you accept that, something unexpected happens. The mystery doesn't disappear, it matures. Because now the interesting questions become better questions. How did Europeans imagine Asia before accurate surveys? Why did map labels become so broad and so durable? How did industrial societies build awe-inspiring architecture so quickly?
Why do online communities keep reinventing lost civilization stories? Why are people more willing to believe in a grand cover-up than in messy historical change? Those are serious questions, and they tell us something real. So let's come back to the premise: Tartaria's final hours. If you mean a literal final day of a hidden empire erased from the record, there is no good evidence. If you mean the final hours of a name, an idea, a cartographic habit, yes, that story is real. Tartary was a historical label used on older maps for large parts of Asia. It was broad, inconsistent, and shaped by limited outside knowledge. Over time, as geography became more precise and political categories changed, the term faded. Later, in the Internet age, that disappearance was reframed by some people as evidence of suppression rather than as an ordinary shift in how the world was mapped and described. And that's maybe the real lesson here. Not that history has no mysteries, it absolutely does. Not that institutions never get things wrong, they do. Not that old maps are boring, they're fascinating. It's that fascination can go in two very different directions. One direction turns every unanswered question into a secret empire. The other direction slows down, checks sources, compares claims, and accepts that sometimes the real answer is less cinematic but more solid. That second path is less addictive, but it gets you closer to reality. And honestly, reality is interesting enough. Because the true story of Tartaria is not that history erased a civilization. It's that vague language, visual confusion, and modern distrust can make almost any mystery look bigger than it is. And once that process starts, people stop asking what happened, they start asking what are they hiding. That shift changes everything.